Hello there, this is Ricardo, and before we go in today's episode, just a quick note from me, Leszek, and ELF Secretariat to thank you so much for listening to our podcast. This has been a privilege, and me and Leszek, we enjoy it tremendously to have this really interesting conversations, but we also hope that it has some value for you to insert liberal values and ideas in the political debate. We're going to be renewed for one more season, so happy holidays, and we'll see you next year. Welcome to the Liberal Europe podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Silvestre, and thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And in this episode, we have back Sven Gerst. He's a philosopher and political economist. He's also the author of the chapter One Ultimate Resource to Rule Them All, Lessons from Economic Thought for Today's European Geoeconomics. This is in issue number 6 of the ELF's Future of Europe journal, that it has the title Securing the Essentials in a Turbulent World, Geopolitics of Resources. We're going to talk about the main thesis of the chapter and how the human mind is the ultimate resource. Our regular listeners know that Sven was on the podcast not too long ago with Leszek Jadrzejewski, where they talk about the need to rebrand liberalism. So now, without further ado, I bring you Sven Gerst. I'm here with Sven Gerst. Sven, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me again.
We're going to talk about your article, One Ultimate Resource to Rule Them All. This is a fantastic piece of writing. Page 68, you offer that the return of geopolitics must not entail a comeback of outdated economic theory. Go a little bit into that, please. What is your main thesis with this sentence?
Yeah, in the last couple of years, I have been giving quite some talks on the topic of geopolitics. And geopolitics itself is a return to a, I would say, anti-liberal approach to foreign affairs and international power politics, so to speak. It's something that liberals didn't have on the agenda and didn't embrace because we know how dangerous it is. Me as a German, I very much know how dangerous the word Geopolitik, which was very much used by the Nazis with people like Karl Haushofer, is. And it is an outdated theory of international affairs. At least that's what we thought, right? Like that goes back to, you get world power when you hold sea power and stuff like that. So that's the geopolitical realm is already a step back. And now we add to an outdated kind of theory that we thought we overcome in terms of the international realm, an economic theory that is, I also think, outdated, and that is the thinking about scarcity of natural resources. I think if you are around European policymakers and around and follow the news, basically, you see that a lot of the current world discussions or global discussions is around the topic of resources and how we get autonomous in that realm. And I think here we go back very much like in geopolitics to an instinct that we have that the world is zero sum. So in geopolitics, we think the world is zero sum. We compete for power, and power is by itself always zero sum. If I'm in power, you are not in power, so to speak, right? That's a very anti-liberal zero sum approach. And the same applies to the logic of scarcity of natural resources, because we have an outdated concept of what a resource is. The material world is stuff, right? And only human beings can create it into resources. But we think, and maybe that's our instinct, that the world contains these resources already, but it does not. The world only contains atoms, and atoms are itself useless. I use in the article one example to make that more tangible. If you dig in your backyard and you find black sticky stuff that ruins your backyard, you don't have usage of it. It's actually bad stuff because it pollutes your backyard. But once we discover that black sticky stuff could be used for energy and is called oil, we find a purpose for it. So this useless material stuff is turned by our creativity into a resource. And now if we adopt this kind of thinking, we see that a lot of the debates that we are having about natural resources is fundamentally misguided, and it's nothing new to economists. Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize about talking about ideas is the ultimate resource, or the economist that I'm more linked to, people like Julian Simon. He was a professor of business in Maryland, I think. He really said, and his book title was, the mind is the ultimate resource. And that's why I think it's an outdated economic concept, the way of thinking about resources, right? And we can go into detail what that entails now, right?
I'm old enough to remember being young men and having a lot of conversations at school, for example, where again it was that idea that resources were finite, and in 10 years we won't have any more oil, and in 10 years we won't have any more minerals, and it's been 15 years since then, and we still find ways with ideas to overcome that question of materiality.
Maybe I could cheer you up because I'm part of that same
Please.
generation in a sense that our school books, I still remember we had classes in school and it was all about we are running out of these resources, right? We are running out of oil, as you have said. That was maybe the most prevalent in my school books where I grew up in Germany. And I think it's very much ingrained in our thinking because it is what is called a Malthusian way of approaching the world. It's going back to the economist's work of Thomas Malthus. Malthus was an 18th century economist, and he wrote, I think in 1798, a famous book on these principles, where he outlines that population at that time was what he was occupied with. Population is increasing exponentially, while our resource discovery is just arithmetically, so like linear, right? So we have exponential growth of human population, and we have a linear growth of resource extraction. And if you put that chart on, and it's always hard to verbalize a chart and bore people with charts, but like if you think about an exponential curve going up, like a hockey stick, and a linear curve of resources putting on top of that, at one point we are literally running out of resources, and that's where we enter what Malthus calls the Malthusian trap, where we have fundamental conflict over these resources. And what I want to highlight here is that this kind of thinking of running out of resources has been always the dominant one in how especially decision makers have been thinking about the world. It's deeply ingrained in our education system. It's deeply ingrained in our approach to the world, but economists have fundamentally pushed back to that.
Let's continue with some more general ideas. On the same page, page 68, you have another interesting concept, which is a serious conversation in the EU about strategic autonomy has been delayed due to language. And naturally, you're a philosopher. This is your realm. But I was very stricken by this particular aspect because normally we don't think about language as being a resistance to change. But in this particular, it is. Tell us why.
Language has or terminology does not only have the advantages of we have conceptual clarity about things, we have the analytical rigor or the academic debates that we can pick on, but there's also something performative about language. We think that through language, things come into existence. If we talk about gender, we very much know what I mean, right? Or marriage, marriage is only constituted when we say yes in front of somebody else, right? That performs the concept of marriage. And similarly, if we have words such as geopolitics and talk about it, it performs. It has impact on the world. If we talk about geopolitics, the world becomes geopolitical because we think geopolitically, right? And the same way, if we talk about resources as natural scarce resources, as in the old paradigm that I just outlined, it constitutes how we approach the world. So getting back to a word or wording or terminology that actually traces back what we want to achieve is fundamentally important. And that's why I push back to say we should not conceive of natural resources as just stuff that is out there, but to understand what we mean by a resource. And the resource is material stuff that is useless to human beings, turned by human creativity in something of value to human beings. We create through our creativity and ingenuity the resource. Before that, it's just stuff. And talking about this and having the vocabulary for it, such as what I call the ultimate resource, or what Julian Simon calls the ultimate resource, is therefore fundamentally important because it has impact how our policy makers approach policy decisions. If we think about strategic autonomy, and that's like very much the talk of the day, people think we have to stockpile stuff. But that's not what it is about. What we want, especially as a European Union, is that we have the best people, creative people, turn the physical world into something of value to our population. And for here, we need to have the paradigm shift in talking about these things. So I make this clear in the article when I talk about artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Artificial intelligence, and that race is not won necessarily by who has the more data centers, access to rare earths or semiconductors, but it's for those people who turn these resources into stuff of value. The DeepSeek moment was, I think, one crucial learning here. It showed us that the race for large language models is not necessarily won by those that have more data centers or more of what we conceived as resources in the AI race, but those that can turn these large language models into proper output. For example, more efficient output, like DeepSeek was a fraction of the costs than the LLMs of OpenAI and whatnot. So it showed us the power of ideas and the power of of people like Julian Simon when it comes to the conceptual angle.
And there is this human ingenuity of doing more with less.
Yes.
So there's this idea that we need to have all this capability, and sometimes people with very little they can do a lot.
Just maybe to highlight here, because you
Sure.
put it beautifully, More from Less is also a book title of a book that I very much recommend and admire. It's by Andrew McAfee, and it's literally called More from Less, where he showed through data and analytics that we are actually in the environmental debate using less resources to get absolutely more output. So we have already seen in many areas absolute peak of usage of plastic or fertilizers or whatever. And it's not that we get now less or at least marginal improvements. No, we get absolute more output, and means economic growth, from using less material. So I think you just put it very nicely, and it's a book title of something that I highly recommend to our listeners.
One last question about concepts. You go into the Malthusian trap, and for our listeners, they definitely need to read your chapter to see how this connects very nicely to liberalism and to concepts of ingenuity, like we're saying, because then we have the cornucopia theory, and then you also go into what is called the Simon Ehrlich wager. So if you can just give us a top line with a little bit of background.
Yeah, thanks for setting that up, because I think the debate between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich is crucial to understand the debates that we are having today. So I talked earlier about Thomas Malthus, and Thomas Malthus was an 18th century economist. So you might say, oh, okay, we know that this is outdated economic theory, but neo-Malthusianism, so the kind of revival or the continuation of that thought, is something that we saw in economic theory quite a lot until today. I would say most people are so-called neo-Malthusians that think that we run into traps of natural scarcity. And somebody who fought that back in a very, I would say, plastic or very tangible debate was Julian Simon. So let me set it up properly. In the 1960s, 70s, there was a big debate about overpopulation once again. And Paul Ehrlich wrote a book in 1968 called The Population Bomb. So Paul Ehrlich was a biologist at, I think, Stanford. And he wrote The Population Bomb. And at that time, it was a large bestseller talking about, the exponential increase of human population, once again, contrasting it with the finite nature of natural resources. And that kind of set up, again, the Malthusian dynamic that we will run out of resources. Now, at this point, Julian Simon jumps in the debate and says, well, let's actually battle out our ideas in the public realm. I challenge you to a bet. So Julian Simon, professor for business at the University of Maryland, challenged Paul Ehrlich publicly for a bet, and says, well, Paul Ehrlich, if you argue that we are running out of resources, we can test that empirically, right? You make a prediction. So let's make a bet. I let you choose 5 natural resources that you can freely choose. And you say, these resources, if they run out, the market price for them must go up. That's the economic logic, right? If something gets more scarce, the price for it goes up. That's like basic economic theory. And he says you can choose the 5 resources that you want to take the bet on. And then we will see who is right, whether the prices for these natural resources go up or whether they decline. So they took the bet in 1980. Paul Ehrlich chose a couple of resources, something like copper, nickel, tungsten, chromium. And what turns out over this bet of a decade, so it was from 1980s to the 1990s, showed that it was not Paul Ehrlich who was right, that we are running out of resources, but the opposite was true. Julian Simon won the bet not on the overall basket, but on all of those 5 resources. By the end of the bet, all of them have been cheaper, meaning more abundant rather than scarce. Because human beings have developed better ways of extracting them, more efficient ways of extracting them, and therefore our need for these resources has still increased, but we got better at dealing with them. So Paul Ehrlich lost the bet on all fronts and had to mail a check to Julian Simon. But as usual with the liberals, we won the debate in terms of, like, literally he won the bet, but he didn't win the public debate. Neo-Malthusianism and that we are running out of resources is very prevalent until today, even though Julian Simon won the debate. And if I talk today with people about Julian Simon, people don't know him. They don't know this debate. It's something that I think economists are even moderately aware of, but the public is really not aware of it. And so I thought, okay, let's bring that back, because the terminology of the so-called cornucopians like Julian Simon has not only won the bet, but is incredibly important nowadays. And I'm happy that some public intellectuals take it on again. I think Ezra Klein has released this year a book called Abundance, which is very much in this tradition of the so-called cornucopians.
I really want to go into your recommendations, because you present 3 big ideas, and I would love for you to go into them with a little more detail, please.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for, especially a philosopher, to make recommendations for policymakers. So they will be rather broad brush and on a more abstract side of things. But they are nevertheless important. And the first one, as you highlighted, is adopting a cornucopian lens, understanding that the vocabulary of talking about resources is different if you take on the abundance or cornucopian perspective, because then you don't talk about stuff, you talk about resources and how to turn things into resources. So the vocabulary is already important. So that's something, the first one. I think I elaborated already the reasons and the background in economic theory of that. The second one then is, okay, if we think that human creativity and ingenuity is the ultimate resource, how can we battle or win this battle for this resource? And here, of course, talent is the most important thing, especially for Europeans, where we have demographics working against us, so to speak. Right? The demographic composition of Europe is set up in a way that we will have less people, and less people means less ideas, less creativity, and less ingenuity, at least per se, if we think about the traditional realm of people like Paul Romer talking about ideas, right? Less people means less ideas. And so how can we deal with that? Well, upskilling is an important part. It's not only that more people will bring more ideas, but better educated people, people that are talented, will have better ideas, so to speak, in turning stuff into resources. So we need to take on the battle the battle for talent. And I think this is a moment in time where we can take on that talent. If we look at the other players in the world, such as China or the United States, then we see that there is not always an appetite for promoting talent. Instead, these are 2 players that are fundamentally stuck into in the paradigm of we talk about natural resources and have geopolitical competition over it. And we see that as we are recording, there are some debates about rare earths once again between these 2 players. And the Trump administration in particular doesn't bolster universities, attracting people through migration. Instead, it's scaling down on all of these aspects. And at the same time, we have China that only plays on access to the old paradigm of natural resources, so through the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, instead of thinking about how can we make our research environment better, how can we attract the best people to our part of the world. So now Europe can step in and really say, well, we take on this battle for resources through a cornucopian lens by getting into the battle for talent. We want to have the best talent, the best universities, the best research over here. So that's the second recommendation.
Hold on. Before you move on, because you do mention a Simon Ingenuity tracker.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for policymakers, you can track that. Like, for example, what is the amount of patents that we have, right? Like, we can track ingenuity, how entrepreneurial, how creative is our part of the population, right? And we have seen here a decline in Europe that seems to be worrisome, right? And that has to go with many different things, such as overregulation or a lack of entrepreneurial spirit within the continent, right, or within the sphere of the European Union. So here we have to really take on a holistic perspective. And a book that I also recommend and throw in here, where this idea of the tracker comes from, is Superabundance is the title of the book. And it's written by two economists from the Cato Institute, and they kind of see themselves in the heritage of Julian Simon. So they say, like, let's implement like a Simon tracker or an abundance tracker. So just to add that there. And then maybe lastly, on the third one, we have to recognize that we are living now in the age of artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence can augment many of human skills, right? So if you think about the realm of ideas again, it's not only that more people or more talented people or more creative people can bolster ideas, but also each individual, augmented through artificial intelligence, can just generate through technological help more solutions and more applications for the material world to become something of value to human beings, right? But that means that Europeans have to become super fluent in AI. I call this the paradigm of AI accelerationism. It has to be deeply ingrained in how we do things, from our education system to how our decision makers think about the world. Now there is some hope here. While I was very grim before on whether European decision makers have taken that into account, this new battle for ideas, I think on the usage of AI, we see that a lot of European countries are amongst the top users of, for example, ChatGPT. And that gives us hope, because if we, even if these models are outside or developed outside of Europe, the application is something that Europeans very much welcome and use. And so we could become the hub for developing more sets of applications through artificial intelligence, so from turning more stuff into actual valuable things through the use of AI, rather than like developing the models ourselves. And I think here we have a great chance, but that for decision makers means that we don't regulate first AI, but we think about how can we make AI something that is deeply ingrained in how people in the European Union do things.
If you allow me an opinion here, and taking the privilege as the host of the podcast, you do mention AI literacy in primary education, but I'm a little bit afraid that AI and this new digital world can make this entire generation just be very lazy, accommodated, not explore the potential not only of the tool but of themselves. Like, for example, we heard a lot of now about ChatGPT doing homeworks for kids, and that kind of danger that I see, exactly as you mentioned, which is to invest in this AI education and to make sure that it is understood by younger generations that this is a tool to be used and not a world to be immersed in a very passive way where you're just using the tools for your own benefit but not to develop your mind. Just an opinion, but I would like to have it on record.
Yeah, maybe let me just add one thing, because I think what you say is important, right? An artificial intelligence or a large language model cannot be creative by itself. I mean, that's the main drawback, in fact, of artificial intelligence, that it cannot generate new ideas by itself. It needs the human ingenuity on top, but it can augment ourselves. So we need to think about augmentation rather than replacement, right? Like the AI should not replace our human efforts, but it should augment our human efforts. And here, I think AI literacy plays a crucial part, because it will tell us which kind of the homework is obsolete, right? Like, if you know, like the same thing as calculating stuff in your head has become obsolete through the calculator. and or like learning stuff by heart might just be to a certain degree obsolete. I had to learn much less poems in school, and nevertheless I think we have the best educated generation of our time in front of us. So I think it's about augmentation, and from here on, from that perspective, decision makers have to take into consideration how do we onboard the new generations in a very meaningful way to the technology that it is actually used to churn out more ideas rather than replace a lot of stuff that we would otherwise learn and that doesn't have much value in nowadays world.
That is the exact message to leave this conversation for now. I've been talking with Sven Gerst. He is the author of the article One Ultimate Resource to Rule Them All, Lessons from Economic Thought for Today's European Geoeconomics. Sven, this was great. It's always great to have you on the podcast. I hope you can keep coming back to have this very enlightening and interesting conversations.
Thank you so much for inviting me. That was a great conversation.
This is all for now. I'll be back soon with more podcasts. You can always visit the website liberalforum.eu to know more about the activities of the European Liberal Forum. So until the next episode, let's keep making the world a better place.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.